Hey everyone, this is the POV episode. It's in two parts. Here comes part one. Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Chris.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Carter.
And I'm AP.
And today we are talking about point of view, POV. We're going to give some definitions real quick because this is a very complicated and very important issue. So we're going to define kind of our terms here real quick. So there's basically three types of POV. Carter, can you give us first person? Can you do it as first person?
I can. So yeah, first person, it's a very commonly employed way of telling a story. It's basically the idea that the narrator is the main character, is the person explaining events that occurred, that they experienced. It's, I took up my sword and rode off to join the army. It's a really common, popular example would be The Hunger Games is told in first person and millions of other stories. So,
And then second person, Chris, is...
Yeah, second person, a lot less common. We won't touch on it too much, but it's the you version of telling the story. So Lemony Snicket, for example, you're about to hear a tale about blah, 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 blah. Or it can be you as a character, the famous Choose Your Own Adventure books, for example, like you walk to the store, you can do this, do that, but you become the character in the book.
Right.
Very uncommon.
And then Lucy, third person, which is the one we're really going to talk about a lot today.
Yeah, and third person is probably arguably the most used in science fiction fantasy writing. Can be broken down into omniscient, and an omniscient narrator would be your sort of all-seeing eagle eye. They would know everything about the story. They would be able to comment on the story as it's happening, comment on the history. They know everything, essentially. Then you've got third limited, which is where you are stuck within the perspective of one character, but it's narrated from using the character's name. So Tom went into the bakery and he bought a loaf of bread. Another subcategory of that would be third person multiple, which is where you essentially have the same idea. You're limited to the perspective of one character, but each character, for example, George Martin does this, each chapter may be from the perspective of a different character, but stuck within that one POV.
Right. And as you said, it's very common. I think first person is also very common in science fiction, fantasy. So for today's discussion, we're really just going to focus on the third person and first person, not really talk about second person, even though it's out there, it's used, but it's not as common. And we should say that these are not the definitions for first or second or third. This is just kind of, because this is a very broad topic, this is just kind of the definitions we're going to be using in our discussion today. Sure. The next thing then, Lucy, is if you could talk about a little bit of sort of what's the importance and the significance of point of view, because it is, as I was reading in one of these writing books, it's really the place as a writer where you start before you've done anything else. Is how do you want to tell your story?
How do you want to tell your story? Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the way that, how do you want your reader to experience your story? So if, for example, you decide to tell the story of a battle, the perspective that you choose to tell that story from is going to greatly affect the way that the reader experiences it. If you use omniscient and you like to describe various different sections of the battle, what the general's doing over here, what the trenches, what's happening in the trenches over there, that's going to give you a broad scope of the battle, maybe an understanding of the interactions between various characters on the battlefield. So you would use omniscient for that.
Right.
If you wanted to give a very close personal experience of the battle that was happening right there and then in the moment, you might choose first person because you could describe the events as they were happening to the main character, and it would give you a very limited individual's perspective of what was happening.
Right.
And
And
so it really present as opposed to first past.
Yeah,
Right.
first present. Yeah, exactly. So it really, I think you have to think about what it is that you want the reader to take away from the story, and then choose your perspective to kind of fit what you're going for. sort of
Right.
thing.
Yeah, because a general's point of view is going to be way different than a soldier's point of view.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think, but even broader than that is one of the things we talked about, beforehand was talking about the intimacy with the reader. So, for example, in the first person, you as the reader are reading things in first person present as they happen to the character. So they're happening in the moment by moment, action by action, thought by thought, emotion by emotion. And that can be very emotional, very dramatic. Same thing with third person close. And it depends. And, again, this is how close you want to get. You can get where you're just seeing, hearing what that character is seeing and hearing. But you can also get into, and Chris, you had mentioned this before we got on mic, which was you can get into their thoughts and their emotions, and they can do a lot of talking about their history.
Yeah, and like in a Joe Abercrombie book, you're going to know what the character had for breakfast, when the last time they went to the bathroom, and also
how they feel about all their friends,
how mean their mother was to them, exactly. All in the same conversation.
Right, and that's a very, very
awesome.
close. Yeah, it is very
That's
awesome.
super close.
Yeah.
Or, for example, you could have someone that's a lot older now looking back upon a battle that happened, so they're narrating still in first person, but that gives you distance and perspective. If you want to talk about what the person has learned during the time,
Exactly.
then that's, you're going to want to choose first person looking back and reflecting, like more of a memoir style. So depends what you're trying to say.
So let's get into this. We're going to talk about third person omniscient first, and the way we're going to do this is
Let's start broad. Go.
start broad and start big and come down. So
Top down approach.
exactly. Lucy, can you brought an example of third person omniscient? Do you mind reading that?
After the events of June the 5th, the villagers of Eastcombe would not remember the young woman that lived at the end of the road. This was partly because they spent a lot of time trying to forget, but also because the young woman made sure they wouldn't remember. Not her herbs, not her book, not even her very irritated cat Bartholomew, who had just begun to grow accustomed to the awful place when he was rudely uprooted and forced to move once again. She arrived on a grey, cloudy Tuesday morning. It was market day, and most of the villagers were in the town square. Many comments were made, of course, as she wandered into their midst. A foreigner, a runaway, a loose woman fleeing her marriage, no doubt. The clothes were cut too low, too high, and so much makeup. But there was one thing they couldn't agree upon, no matter how hard they tried. None of them could see eye to eye on the color of her hair. So I wrote this example basically just to show that with an omniscient narrator, you can get into the heads. You're in the head, you're in the perspective of, I think, 4 or 5 different people. They're
The
in
whole village, really.
The whole village,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
And the
So
Well, I would say, you're actually you're actually not in, not to go too against it, but you're not really in the opinion of the villagers themselves.
you're right.
You're in the
yeah.
village. You're in the opinion of the village, kind of as a mass
At large.
At large, right?
You're right, exactly. So if you want to show how an entire town experiences one event, it's a great way to start wide, essentially.
Yeah.
It also lets you bring in a lot of historical and world building information that might be clunkier if you're doing close narration. A lot of times in like trying to write fantasy and stuff, we always talk about how you don't want to do too much world building. And I think that can be less of a problem when you're using omniscient narration, because it sort of makes sense that somebody who knows everything about the world would be able to give you the relevant pieces of information. If you're doing close narration, you kind of need like a dialogue reason or a reason for the character to be thinking about, the ancient kingdom of Mercia or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So if I wanted to tell this story, I've just bought myself the ability I can tell the history now of the village if I want to, because the narrator would know that. I'm not tied to the perspective of one character.
And you talk about her herbs right away and that she disappeared, and obviously there's some magical stuff going on because you have this larger viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. So I've bought myself a lot of freedom, but then I also lose certain things at the same time.
Right. And just going back to what Carter said a second ago, and I know bringing it back to what we talk about in the writing group all the time is we'll say things like, there's too much exposition in this. We'll say, how often, right? We're always commenting like, hey, I like this, but then you do a whole page of exposition, and it's the author having to explain the world. And most of us, I think it's pretty safe to say, write in close third. So it's the character literally thinking about the world for a whole page, which can slow the pace, cuts the drama. And so one of the things we're always talking about, and you just reminded me about this, Carter, is how do we get that exposition, world building, what have you, history, whatever, into a story when you're in close third? And it has to be through dialogue, or it has to be through some other means, because you don't have a third person omniscient. You don't have a narrator say, well, it was interesting in this time and place because this, and this, and they can explain for a page and a half of why the world is the way it is.
Yeah, you've got to find a way to motivate that character's like, what would make him think about this, and then...
Right, and we're always talking about that, where the characters will come into dialogue. I mean, this is one of the things I'm always doing with people is, like, you always having characters doing ask and answer, or they're like, well, gee, Lucy, what made you think about the world today? And then it has to be, oh, well, when I was small in the world, and it's like, okay, this is not doing anything.
Yeah, so that's why it's used, I think, so often in big epic fantasy, because you've got these huge worlds, they've got their histories, there's a lot of world building to get in there.
Yeah, the bigger the world, the more likely it is that the omniscient is a good way to tell the story, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about third-person omniscient and not talk about Tolkien or Eddings or Feist, who are these massive fantasy worlds. And they're classical in nature when it comes to fantasy, but like epic classic fantasy loves third-person omniscient because they do talk about, all these kingdoms, all these races, all this history. And there was a great way of talking about it.
Yeah, it definitely strikes me as sort of an old school thing that can definitely still be used effectively. I'm sure there's a lot of people doing really fresh stuff with third omniscient. It doesn't have to be like, I think it's important to point out that it doesn't have to be one or the other for the whole story. Like, for example, I just finished listening to The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia McKillip, and that book basically starts with third omniscient. It starts with like this big, broad historical overview of the main characters. Like, it starts with like her great grandpa and describes like how he passed magic down. And then by the time you get to Sybil, the main character, you're pretty much following her in close third for the rest of the book. So she kind of uses the third omniscient to give exposition, and then we're following this one character for the rest of the book, and it totally works.
That's interesting. Actually, Robert Jordan does that same thing. He starts his books with the wind that goes across the entire land and then zooms in on one person.
Well, I think it becomes, and I don't think it's not that it's not a modern technique. I think it is still used, in my opinion, quite a lot. It's just that it becomes very exhausting to do the whole thing in omniscient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At some point, I think narrators or writers want to get down into the scenes and, be guiding you through using a specific character. And to do the entire thing in omniscient can get a bit exhausting for a reader, because you're constantly...
I was just going to say, the reader also is going to want to glom onto a particular character.
That's what I was going to say. I feel like
Exactly.
we've changed a bit as a society or as a culture, because I went back and read Tolkien and Eddings and Feist recently. I mean, the Bulgariad and The Magician's Apprentice. And I wanted that emotional connection, and it wasn't there.
So it's like the way we've used it has changed, I think.
Absolutely.
It sort of still serves its purpose, but it's not the whole thing. It's not the entire story.
Well, and as Carter pointed out, I think you can mix and match these. I'm not saying yet that's, if you're a first-time writer or an amateur writer, that's how you want to start off. But you can start as third-person omniscient and begin with, here is the whole world, and here's all this stuff, blah, blah, and begin to filter down. And as you mentioned, Carter, come down to a POV character, a close third-person character, and then tell the story from there. And then even come back out at some point and reorient the character or the reader with the world, and then go back in. So it's not like you have to pick one or the other, but you really have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, you need to know what you're doing is, I think, the important thing. And I do kind of agree with AP that, like, and maybe it's just me, like, I definitely want to follow a character as the narrative unfolds, you know? Like, I feel like close third, when you're writing speculative fiction, close third works really well because if you're writing in, say, first person or third person omniscient, it kind of asks the reader to buy into, like, someone is actually telling me these things. It kind of is less immersive than in close third when you're following a character through a fantasy world. And I don't know if that makes sense. It's like kind of easier for me to get lost in the alternate reality when I'm not being told the information.
You're not being constantly reminded that there's a frame involved.
Right,
here.
exactly.
Right, yeah.
Exactly.
I think it depends on the subject matter for me. It depends what we're talking about, sort of thing. Like Stephen King does it really well in The Stand. He's talking about a massive outbreak. And so he wants to, as a writer, show how that manifests itself and how it affects not only a small group of people, but an entire country of people. And so he uses omniscient to describe the context around what the characters are experiencing, which I don't know if you're interested in that sort of thing. I think I can go with it. I think it works. But if he wanted to, I think Jose Saramago does this in Blindness. There's also an outbreak. It's an outbreak story, but he wants to tell the story from a very limited perspective of one person experiencing the outbreak. So he does it through the personal, the close.
That's how, like World War Z, Max Brooks's book is the same thing.
Exactly. It depends what kind of subject matter you're trying to explore and what message you're trying to get across, I think, for me.
So, Chris, we've been talking about third-person omniscient. In summary, kind of what are you thinking in terms of pros and cons? What are the pros that we've mentioned here, you think?
Well, the obvious one is that in omniscient, you can hop into anybody's point of view in the story. So you can show plot points, you can show like bigger picture stuff by jumping around, as opposed to like if you're stuck in one person's perspective, you're only going to see the world that part of the world that person sees.
Right.
So to me, that's the obvious one.
Like it's definitely, if you're writing something on the scale of Lord of the Rings, like there's a reason why it's in third omniscient. Because
right.
He's telling, there's all these moving parts happening all over Middle Earth, and it would be, like I think, like Anton said before we were on mic, if it was third close, then it would just be a story about two hobbits running through the woods.
You wouldn't even see the ants, and that would suck.
No, you would literally just walk past them.
You'd see the Oliphants, though.
Right,
Maybe.
you would see the Oliphants.
Yeah. And also when you're, another thing that it buys you is when you're writing fantasy. I know everyone talks about this as an example, but Harry Potter, you wouldn't know that it's a fantasy book if you just started with Harry under the stairs. So a lot of times fantasy authors will use it to say, hey, there's magic in this world. It's going to come. You'll get there. But not yet,
right.
sort of thing.
Let me set you up first.
Let me set you up with the big kind of magical stuff.
Yeah.
And then, you can get deeper into the one character.
And then the con to omniscient, of course, and we mentioned it earlier, but it's worth saying again, is that loss of intimacy. Is that because you are at 30,000 feet, so to speak, you don't get into the heads of a character, or if it's multiple third person, multiple characters. And so as modern readers, and I think that's worth saying, we lose that closeness, intimacy, that emotional depth, which I think is where a lot of drama and a lot of these books nowadays comes from.
I agree. I think it's important too, and I think AP said this off mic about it can seem a little musty.
Right, another good con, yeah.
It's not necessarily, it is still being used today for sure, but it's not necessarily the most modern sounding way to tell a story.
Right.
You corrected me to the classical earlier, which is
Did
right.
I? Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's formal. It's a very formal way of telling a story.
Yeah.
I mean, I went back and read The Battle of Helm's Deep, and it was just like...
Yeah, it comes off a little staid, yeah. But then the flip side to that, the pro to that, is then the author is allowed to sort of speak, is the word sort of extra
omnisciently?
Omnisciently. I was gonna use another $2 word. The author is able to come across in any way that they want, and they can give a history of the world. They can talk about any part of it, and with the understanding that the reader is going to go with them.
Well, yeah, in the Battle of Helm's Deep, he tells us, why it was built, its fortifications and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and if you care about that, great. Here you go. Here's 4 pages about the history of Helm's Deep. Go nuts.
But can I play devil's advocate
Please.
to that? I feel like when you say it's musty or it's not modern, I feel like that is coming across as musty because you're reading an old example of the way that omniscient was used. Tolkien is ancient at this point.
Right.
He's not using the omniscient narrator in a modern sense. There's nothing musty about The Stand because Stephen King uses it in a way that still feels very modern. He starts wide, but he knows how to get into the character's experience very, very quickly. So
I agree with that.
The Stand is a little different genre-wise. I mean, if you look at stuff even from the 80s that is omniscient, it's still in that Tolkien style of it, and that's 50, 60 years later.
I would even add that when people do use omniscient now, I would say I don't want to make a blanket statement, but it really is more of a framing device. Like, I really don't feel like even the people that are omniscient, they will come down from 30,000 feet to 10,000 feet. Like, they're not going to stay soaring as high. Yeah.
For example, in The Stand, you get chapters like, I forget the musician's name, but like you where he goes home and he goes and sees his mother and stuff. Like, that's very close in. Like, so he zeroes in. So he uses it as more of a framing device. And I realize that saying musty is sort of a loaded term. And
because it's still using the omniscience.
Yeah.
It's used still, all the time.
Absolutely. But I do think that there is a danger of when you use it
too much.
Yeah, that it can come off as like, again, I don't want to use the load term like dated or something because you can do it without that, but that's a risk in using.
It's a risk. It's a risk. Yeah, it's a risk. You need to know what you're doing.
You got to be very careful with using it. And I think like I've been saying, the people that use it effectively are the ones that can use it as can set you up and then say, okay, here's the world. We're going to get away from that because I don't want you to stay at 30,000 feet. I want you to be able to get into this story.
Yeah.
To me, it's like less that it seems dated. Like, I don't mind if something seems dated if I'm reading epic fantasy, for example. But it's more like it just breaks my brain a little bit. Like, I'm like, who is this story about? Like who is experiencing this? And who is this, like, godlike voice coming out of the ether to tell me about all this stuff?
And you're taken out of the story at that point, right? I mean,
For me, as a reader, definitely.
That's an absolutely great point. That's a great way of saying it.
Thank you.
No, because that's what I experienced when I was just rereading The Magician's Apprentice. It did break my brain. I was like, wait, so who is this? Who's telling the story? Who's the main character?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty hard for us to talk about third-person omniscient and not bring up fairy tales and middle grade. And I'm going to toss it over to you, Lucy, because you write middle grade.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm drawn to omniscient because it's used so much in middle grade. You get that sense of a narrator that's telling you a story, which feels very comforting, like fairy tales used to be written. And an example that I thought of actually that was really, really, really great was Cressida Cowell's new book, The Wizards of Once. And she actually uses an omniscient narrator all the way through the book to tell the story. She gets inside the heads of little creatures and all the characters within this fantasy world. But she does it so cleverly that, at the start, you're definitely getting that wider context. This is the history of the world. This is the magic within it. These are the conflicts that are set up within it. And then she manages to kind of vanish herself away. Even though it's still the narrator that's telling the story, you do get that sense of intimacy from the characters because she gets closer and closer and closer to them to tell the scenes. Comes back out, goes back in, comes back out, goes back in. And that is a trick that is, really clever. And
I think that hits on something that, we haven't really talked about, but we have, but it's important to understand that these are not monolithic definitions. So when we say omniscient, it's exactly like you said, Lucy, like you can be at 30,000 feet and at a point in the story where it starts with once upon a time or in the world and it is the voice of the narrator coming across very strong and loud, but then it can drop down very, 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 very close to where the narrator is literally saying, Tom went through the magic trapdoor and into the world of, it's still omniscient. It's not Tom saying that. So it's it's not close where we're inside of Tom's head, but we're sort of right behind his head.
On his shoulder.
Exactly.
On his shoulder. Well said, exactly.
That's why it impresses me so much, because it's how you come in and out without... You know instantly when it's been done wrong because it jolts you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it takes you out of the story, precisely.
We say it all the time in writer's group, like, hey, I think there's a jarring kind of...
Right. We'll talk about a POV wobble sometimes,
Yeah, if you mess it up, it's super obvious.
If you mess it up, it's so obvious, which is why I think when you're starting out, people are drawn so quickly to third person limited or first person, because it's like, these are the perimeters, let's stick to them, Omniscient adds this whole other...
I remember the first time I was
aspect.
in a writing class, like, as an adult taking like novel writing class, and I turned in a piece and it's horrible. And that's the first time someone said like, oh, you switch POVs, and I went going, I don't know what you're talking about. Like,
Do I?
what's a POV? But then I read it now, I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, of course you have no idea what's going on.
Because you're figuring it out.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying, I think a lot of people find really comforting about third-person omniscient in the way that you're talking about it is that we all had stories read to us by our parents. So if the third-person omniscient is like our parents reading us a story, then of course the emotional connection is there.
Of course that's comforting.
I mean, you're comfortable, you're getting this story told to you, and it's just beautiful and magical, and you get that sense of wonder.
Getting into a little Freudian psychology.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're really
That's
casting
a
quite
great point,
Hey,
though.
this is
That's
season
probably
2
why
of our podcast.
it feels so
We're asking the tough
comforting.
questions.
Get a little
now.
backstory there on AP. I like it.
I never thought about that. That's
But no, seriously, like you brought up audience, and I think that's a great point. Would you say that third person omniscient is like more digestible to younger readers in general?
I just possibly. I mean, I do think that when it's used for adults in fantasy, especially, it can be really, really effective.
Yeah.
But definitely, I think for kids, you get that sense of someone's telling you a story now.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like an artistic choice of like, what is the story about? If the story is about the world and these fantastic events, and in the case of a fairy tale or a middle grade book, the story is often really about the moral message,
Right,
the Aesop of the story. Whereas if you're writing, for YA or adults, maybe the story is more about these specific characters and their experiences and how they grow and change.
And a metaphor for high school.
And, yeah.
But Carter has a point. The narrator is able to reflect on the moral issues, within a middle grade story.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Because you've got yourself so much freedom.
So there's also third person limited or third person multiple, which we've been talking about omniscient, but there's also I guess it's also called third person close, right, Chris?
Close
Sure,
third.
yeah.
Close third, right?
Yeah, so third person limited is where you're, restricted to one particular character's mind. You're limited to their perspective, their thoughts and their emotions.
Right.
And that goes along with third person multiple, which is the same thing, except like George R.R. Martin style, you go chapter to chapter, you can go from one person's limited perspective to another person's limited perspective.
And we've even seen that in short stories where they'll switch mid-story, and there's like a
little page break
there's a
or
page
whatever.
break or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we were talking before, like you can get POV wobbles. So it's when you're doing multiple POV, you'll want to make sure that there's you do some kind of break to indicate to the reader, hey, we're going to someone else now.
Yeah, you at least want to start a new paragraph.
Yeah,
at the very least.
exactly. For those of you out there just starting out, start a new paragraph. Yeah, indent. Exactly.
Well, Carter, you've got. Let's hear your third person close.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like close third is kind of the only way that I've ever really been able to write effectively or even close. So I have an example from this book I'm working on now, and it's very rough drafty, but I think it kind of shows some of the advantages or some of the things that you can do with close third anyway. So here we go. Aiko slid off the bed, stretched, and threw open her wardrobe. She donned the same head-to-toe black as Corinne, wrapped a black scarf around her neck, hunted down her darkest lipstick, and even tied her auburn hair up in a black ribbon to complete the outfit. Black was a good color for her. She double-checked herself a few times in the mirror before turning around. Is this stealthy enough? What? Corinne said. Who said that? I can't see anything. Lovely. She thought of her impending conversation with the so-called Captain Tom, assuming that they made it that far. What would she ask him first? What exactly did she hope to gain? Corinne had made it sound like this man held all the answers. She felt a severe need to understand his motives, his plans, how exactly he planned to take down the company, as Corinne had put it. As impossible as it sounded, it had given her a tiny grain of hope, which was more than she'd had before. So I kind of think that being able to like write from one character's perspective with the narrator kind of not in the story at all lets you do some of the things that I'm doing here, where you get her feelings about things. You don't have to like tell the reader exactly how she feels about things. You can kind of give her internal monologue interspersed with dialogue and other stuff.
And there's questions in there. I mean, and like, so who is asking the questions? It's Iko.
It's
essentially
herself.
It's you're in her mind and the questions are being asked, so you can really get into the. And there's at least 2 questions in there. What were they again?
She's like, what she's thinking about, like what she's going to ask this guy that they're going to interrogate.
Yeah. So sorry, I had the same technical things where she literally says something like, "I like that." She likes the black scarf. So we're getting an emotional preference. We're getting something that this is within inside the character's head.
Right.
I think it's important to note too, like, with omniscient, technically you can be at this level when you're omniscient. The narrator can say, she liked this black scarf. She wondered why such and such was going to happen. But I think the difference is that when you're omniscient, there's the expectation that you pull back then at some point. You come out from it. I mean, I maybe I'm just projecting, but I think with third person, we know we're going to stay here the whole time.
Yeah, and it's also maybe a little more showy than telly. If you are in this character's head, then you can kind of just like have her thoughts there in the narration without having to step back and filter it and say, then she thought about what she was going to ask the man. You can just write the question. So
right, and you don't have to pull back and say, and in this bigger world, here's how scarves are made, and these scarves are imported from... Right, yeah, you don't have to... You can just stay in the moment.
Yeah, I cut my pages about scarf supply chain.
Scarf import, exports. No, that's good. I really like them, but yeah.
Yeah, I think what you said about being able to get rid of a lot of filtering is a really useful part of using this type of perspective. It gives you an intimacy that you don't get with the overarching viewpoint a lot of the time. So
I think it's a real storyteller's choice of perspective, because if you want to just tell that story, what is going on, what is happening, what is the ride that you're taking the reader on, you don't have to worry about things like first person voice. Is the character unique? Does he have a unique perspective on the world? You can't get this stuff into it, but you really do clean out a lot of the issues that come with the rest, and you're allowed to tell a clean story from one person's
and I think that's why
perspective.
it's so popular. I think I remember I had a teacher tell me that the reason it's a good place to start is because, number one, a lot of stuff is written this way. So when you're reading as a writer, you can read this stuff and see how it works. But I think also as a writer, you understand it a little bit more innately. With first person, you have to constantly be aware of where you are as the writer, as the character. Or if you're omniscient, you have to be constantly aware of, is the story bogging down? Is this too much? Am I just writing on and on and on? Whereas when you're in third person, you're constantly, you can sort of place yourself in the mind of the character and be able to say, okay, this is what this character is doing right now, at this moment, even whether it's limited or multiple.
This is how they feel about this.
This is how they feel about
reaction.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think, if we're talking pros and cons, I think you get that intimacy, which is great. You can talk about their thoughts, their emotions, their background. But I think it also then kind of the flip side of that is that you can only talk about that character when you're with that character at the moment.
And it goes back to what we were talking about, the third person omniscient, whereas now modern readers in fantasy do want that intimacy, which is why we see so much of Game of Thrones or Joe Abercrombie, where you've got chapters or paragraphs of zooming into this one character and being with them the whole way, and you get to know the characters so well.
Yeah, and that's probably from just generations of film and television where we're used to being...
It's definitely, I think, a byproduct of different mediums coming into our lives and different ways to experience stories, and a desire for modern readers to get really close to the characters and experience it in a much more I don't want to say
thoughtful, it's close, it's very, I want to say mindful, but that's not even remotely close to the right word, but Yeah, it's this idea that we can come in and do within somebody's head, but also, with a distance. It's called third person close or third person limited for a reason, where the idea is you can, and again, much like omniscient, you can kind of zoom in and out a little bit, but you're always in their head, so to speak. So if you're just talking about what they see or feel or touch, that's fine. You can stay at that level. You can even, there's one we haven't talked about, which is what is it called, Lucy? I forget now. The third person objective, where it's just the third person, but they're like a reporter. They're just saying what's going on.
Yeah, so there's varying degrees to which you get close and distant from the character. One of the things I love about it is the ability that you have to create dissonance between the character's experience of something and reality. So you could have an interaction between two characters, and one of them could be being really, really, really nice to your main character. But because the main character doesn't like that person, or if they're in a really bad mood, or if they see, something's just happened to them, you can have them experiencing that situation as violent or nasty, or, even if the person that's talking to them is just trying to give them something or is being nice. So you can create this, you can really show that the world there is no objective reality. What is happening within someone's head is the truth to them.
Right.
Sort of
And
thing.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to jump on the back of that and kind of show the other side of that. Is often we talk about having characters that are relatable as opposed to likable. And if we're third close, you can have a character that is awful, but because you're inside their head and it's so close, you understand them, so they become relatable and become a compelling character that you want to read about.
Exactly. We've all been in that situation. Like, I'm having such a bad day. I just want this do-gooder to get out of my face, sort of thing. And that's okay. They're not necessarily being nice, but we all get it.
Because if you were in third omniscient at that point, you'd just be like, wow, this person's just being rude and harsh.
Right, because you're distanced. You're at a distance, I should say.
You would just have more of a distance. It would sound something more like, Jerry really wanted to get away from the person, but they kept yapping. You just wouldn't get that same ability to describe the surroundings and the atmosphere.
Totally.
Which is another con, or another, that we talked about, which is because you're close third, you're in this person's head. And I think we see this all the time in the writing group, which is it can be a real challenge to world building, because we always talk about like exposition dumps or info dumps, where because we're so close in this character, we need to get this information out about the world or the universe they're in or whatever, that it just kind of bogs it down. Whereas if you were omniscient, you could just stop the narration or stop the story and go, oh, let me explain to you,
Here's some exposition.
Here's some exposition. This is why the forest is doing what's going on. Here's why they're here. Where this is why the empire is moving in on the. Whereas if you're in third person close, it has to be that person thinking about it or talking.
You have to work harder to make it.
You got to work a little bit
flow
harder.
in the story.
Exactly. It's got to keep moving. Exactly.
It's really awkward when you mess that up, as we see all the time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's really common.
We've all done that.
Yeah.
We're all doing it probably right now.
I'm doing it right now.
But you do get access to awesome things like you can describe a smell immediately through that character's perspective, and you can say that it smelled like whatever chemicals, or you can, if you're using an omniscient narrator or first person, you have to use that lens and you have to say
the character smells.
Yeah, exactly. So you lose the sense of immediacy.
Yeah.
I think it's really one of the closest.
I remember one of the writing tricks that I was taught was if you're writing in third person close, you're always writing sight. Like that's always the one that you write from. The character saw, the character is always seeing the action. And one of the ways to bring the reader in is to write from the other four senses. If they can smell things, if they can touch things, if they can taste things, that's a great way to bring people in closer. So you close that gap between the reader and the character.
Yeah, to me, at least like as a newer writer, I feel like third close is like kind of the best of both worlds, because you get that internality and the subjectivity of first person narration almost, without having to do all that filtering that you need with like, if you're doing omniscient narration, you have to always tell the reader who's experiencing what and why and how, and when you know that you're following one character, you don't have to do that.
Right.
But there's also no like, so with first person, you have like a character has to be the narrator. Like somebody's got to be the I
Right.
in the story. Whereas with third close, you don't really need a narrator. It's almost like the narrator's kind of written out of the story.
Right.
And you can still be as internal as you want with the character, or a little, or the camera can hang back a little bit, but you don't have to frame it really. And it's a lot smoother to me.
That's a good way to put it.
That was part 1 of the POV episode. Stay tuned. Part 2 is coming up.